alikuwa na mbao juu. Alisema naenda PE. Akirudi nilimpata akimeza P2. Alikuteka. So niko stuck katikati kama stick ya mshikaki. Nampenda huyo mshikaji but kiatu tu ndo najua story. Yani vile mi mchocha nimemflash bahati mbaya juu niko na deni ya boba. Call him, yani vile mi ukanyaga matope kabla nifike kwa lami. Na ile stress mi upitia kabla nimbongeshe kilami. Yani vile mi mpandisha taxi na naenda kudandia gari ya moshi. Yani vile mi umhasilia dikiatu yangu naanza kutoa moshi. Yani vile mi umuita baby. Tunajua nikimuita Njerio R naanza geuka L. Na hiyo mama zako nimeispoil. Yani vile nimetama kani timba yangu naanza geuka Sanda. Kani vile yani kani kukopa nimekopa, yani kani kokoka nimekoka, yani kani 9 nimepigana tu nilivishia fika yake namba 8. Hata usiku nipate menchora 8 toa moja 7. Ile nimesaga mpaka toja nikamdanganya mimi naishigi umoja nikamwasha mpaka mimi simu na vioja eti na wako mahakamani kusolve vitimbi za dunia bila shaka mashtaka. Yani vile tele dunia kasimama atasimama pamoja. Yani vile kama penzi ni nywele basi nimemsetia nati. Yani vile kama penzi ni kikozi basi bila shaka niko na TB, niko na fever jona niumiza. Yani vile kama penzi ni mistari basi nimemwandikia sentensi matenzi mpenzi na kuenzi vishenzi. Niko cheesy crazy mwizi au mapenzi funge. I'm guilty. You have to testify. As my shoes, breathe and fiat, breathe and fiat. As my shoes, breathe and fiat, breathe and fiat. Hey, baby, yeah. That's storyteller.
DJ Dan 790 gmail.com.
Ibaridi ni mbaya, ibaridi imetetemeka ya kutosha, kuja unikumbatie. Nimejaribu kahawa, nikajaribu gate. Najua ukikuja utafanya idisapie. Shida zangu si za dokta, shida zangu si za vodka. Sema leo utatoka na mimi nitakungoja. Shida zangu si za dokta, shida zangu si za vodka. Sema leo utatoka na mimi nitakungoja. Sema nijipange, sema nijipange. Ningependa kukuona leo. Tujipange, sema nijipange, sema nijipange. Ningependa kukuona leo. Tujipange, ulo.
Natamani lako joto, natamani maso. Nimetetemeka ya kutosha, njoo nikumbatie. Nimejaribu blanketi, moto kwenye fireplace. Najua ukikuja utafanya disappear. Shida zangu si za dokta, I'm always scared. Yeah, niambie utatoka na mimi nitakungoja. Shida zangu si za dokta, shida zangu si za vodka. Yeah, niambie utatoka na mimi nitakungoja. Sema nijipange, sema nijipange. Ningependa kukuona leo. Tujibambe, tujibambe. Sema nijipange, sema nijipange. Ningependa kukuona leo. Tujibambe, oh Lord, oh Lord.
Nakuahidi nikishikamani,
It's DJ Dan Paul.
hautawahi kosa maziwa asali.
DJ Dan Paul.
Kila siku tutaweka bati. Najua vile unapenda sherehe, vile ninapenda sherehe. No, no, no. Mtoto kipuko, sema kile unaona kwa ndoto. Nami nitatimiza yote. Dunia ni ndogo zitapita, ukipenda mziki katika hizi misimu zitapita, na hizi picha zitatukumbusha kila mtu anapenda good life. Yeah, yeah. Wewe mwenyewe unajipa good time. Toto kiboko, sema kile unaona kwa ndoto, nami nitatimiza yote. Yeah, yeah. Dunia ni ndogo, sema kama tusafiri soto, ama Argentina, Amerika. Tukumbuke vile, tukumbuke vile, tukumbuke vile. Soul generation, love, yeah. Nimepatikana na ugonjwa wa mapenzi, hapo naniona mimi sijiwezi, nakulishwa ma good times na masensi. Mapenzi siku za wiki sasa zina feel kama ni wikendi, nikakupewa massage happy ending, but this time around I won't let you go. No, 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 'cause girl I need your medicine. Nikikuona mama nimepona, come through me make a scene. Sinema hawajawaiona, I need you one times three. Dosage ya daily, girl I need your medicine, your medicine, your medicine. Oh, love, love, soul generation. Love, 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 love. Only love, only love, only love. Okay, niko na fever, Akina shiva. La 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 la. Yeah. I need a healer, come be my dealer. La 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 la. Oh yeah, yeah. I'm under pressure, be my stress reliever. La 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 la. Love, love, nikituma location, je utadeliver. La 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 la. Niko ICU, in ICU. I'm under the flu, but the remedy is you. My night nurse, you fight us. Is the only answer. Girl, I need your medicine. Nikikuona mama nimepona, come through me make a scene. Sinema hawajawaiona, I need you one just three. Dosage ya daily, but girl I need your medicine, your medicine, your medicine. Oh. Oh yeah, yeah. Only love can make you feel this good, baby. Dr. Soda, pia mimi nimejipenda. Tell me where you need me, nina issue to within. Nimebeba dawa kuwa ready to receive. Show me the place where you're feeling the pain, mama. You need some healing today. My ambulance is coming your way. Na nikikuja ninakuja to stay. All my days, girl, I need your medicine. Nikikuona mama nimepona, come through we make a scene. Ni sinema hawatawaiona.
Bonjour. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's 2 p.m. in East Africa, so we are going to start because we have an online audience. So to ensure that we are now all centered and grounded in this room, I'm going to request us to sit straight in our chairs and do 3 breathing exercises. So let's sit straight on our chairs and just breathe in the air that shouldn't be bought by any markets and breathe it out. So let's breathe in. Breathe out. Second round, breathe in and breathe out. Third round, breathe in and breathe out. Thank you very much. I believe that we are now all centered in this room, and we are all happy to share the air that we breathe. So welcome to this session. Thank you for making the time. I believe that there are so many competing demands, but you found this very important, so we do not take it for granted. This is track 4, session 2, Reimagining Economies for Climate Justice. My name is Eunice Musime. I'm the Executive Director of Akina Mama Africa. I'll be moderating this session, and I hope that we'll have an enriching discussion. We have an online audience, so we welcome our online audience to the space as well. So the context for this panel, we are bringing together experts, activists, policymakers to envisage structural economic transformation in the service of climate justice, with a specific focus on the realities and perspectives of the African continent. We are also spotlighting and amplifying feminist perspectives, approaches, with a focus on extractive industries in Africa, and my colleague right here will be taking that part. But we are also going to be focusing on specific macroeconomic policy proposals. We believe that actually that's the offering that we would want to take out of this session. We all know that macroeconomics are centered on concentration of power, upholding the private profit imperative, and market-based solutions. Our current global order actively subordinates most of the global population, especially women, girls, and gender-diverse persons. We also know that patriarchal fossil fuel capitalism, fueled by extraction, has also directly created this climate crisis. And it's busy exploiting and abusing both nature and the labor of women, girls, and gender-diverse persons, while continuing to hinder attempts to advance equity and justice in international and national contexts. We also know that there's widespread revenue losses due to illicit financial flows, debt service, and inequitable trade agreements, including unjust investor protection agreements that cause governments to resort to indirect consumption-based taxes that disproportionately impact women, girls, and gender-diverse persons. We know at the same time, decades of neoliberal capitalist policies have resulted in non-existent public services and infrastructure. The care work often provided by women subsidizes these failures of the state. But these are not failures of just the state. They're failures of the global system, without being recognized as a crucial contribution to the global economy according to current underpinnings. So as the world continues to grapple with the COVID-19 pandemic effects, war and conflict, and widespread climate and environmental crises, all of which disproportionately impact on women, girls, and gender-diverse persons, we need a systemic and structural transformation. We all know that an alternative space was being held at the People's Summit, and it said that one of the things we really needed to focus on was systems change. It's not about climate action, but systems change. So it's important for us to see that that is actually going to happen. And together with me this afternoon To help us unpack and interrogate all these concepts is a panel, very well constituted, 3 women, 1 man, and that's the order we need to continue seeing. So we look forward to listening to them. I will introduce panelists by panelists so that you remember which panelist is speaking. So I will begin with my right, Mukupa. She's a tax and natural resource governance lead at Tax Justice Network. She's a development professional who is currently leading the tax and natural resource governance work at the Tax Justice Network. Her expertise lies in tax policy and natural resource governance and issues that focus on areas of extractive industries. She has a very elaborate bio, but I'll let you Google it and find it on the internet. So I'll invite Mukupa to take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Eunice.
Let's encourage her. Let's encourage her.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really nice to see you all here, and thank you for taking the time to come and listen to us. As Eunice has pointed out, I think we did a paper, I co-authored a paper with Rachel, who's also part of the tax justice movement, where we were just trying to reflect on the nexus between tax justice, climate justice, and some of the implications on gender justice, as well as social injustice. So our entry point really is the tax justice piece, and now with the energy transition and the climate change agenda, we are trying to answer the question, how can we do it differently, especially when it comes to the extractive industries, right? As you all know, and as has already been elaborated well, Africa's extractive industry is underpinned under a colonial and capitalist legacy, right? And if you look at the numbers, Africa actually is losing quite a lot from the extractive industry due to capital flight and illicit financial flows, given the fact that we are losing about 40 billion annually in illicit financial flows from the continent, right? This is just the extractive industry alone. And this capital flight or illicit financial flows undermines Africa's capability to mobilize resources to finance its development. But not only its development, we are now in an era where we're talking about climate finance, right? And so the question we were trying to address through our paper is, how do we use tax as a tool to mobilize resources that could be used for the broader development financing, but more importantly also for climate, right? Whether it's adaptation or issues around loss and damage, which is a reparations issue, the question of Africa begging needs to change going forward. And in this paper, which shall be shared, I think, online as well as on the different sites, seeks to look at the different ways in which tax can be used as a tool to mobilize resources. And so we developed what is called, well, these principles have already been there, what we call the principles of tax justice. And the title of the paper is called The Principles of Tax Justice and the Climate Crisis in Africa's Resource-Rich Countries. So we zoned in on Africa's resource-rich countries to reflect on 5 key aspects. Due to time, I'll only focus on 3 and just share with you some of the things that we were bringing out in terms of how tax can be used as a tool for financing. So as has already been highlighted, I think tax injustice is very prominent in Africa's extractive industry. And tax injustice results to several other injustices, right? So we see that due to the extraction that is happening at local level and even globally, the climate injustice piece comes into play, right? And the polluters, the big multinational companies that are involved in this extraction, are refusing to pay for loss and damage. And so that in itself is injustice. The other injustice we see is that the women who are at the local level experience land grabs, water pollution, environmental pollution, and they're the ones that have to bear the brunt of the negative impacts of extraction. So in that sense, it's a gender injustice. Social injustice as well is something that we see. It's a sector where we see social injustice. I think about the DRC and the children that are involved in child labor, right? Extracting the critical minerals for the phones and laptops that we should use, that they'll never be able to use because they are not able to go to school. So that in itself is a social injustice. And so when we look at tax injustice and bring out these other three injustices, the question then becomes, in an era of the climate crisis where we are seeing an increased demand for critical minerals, how do we do things differently going forward? We cannot afford to do mining the way it's been done over the past 100 years, right? In my country, we've been doing mining for 100 years. I come from the copper-rich country of Zambia. And when you go to some of those communities, it's a sad state of affairs. And so what we need to be asking ourselves going forward is, what structural issues do we need to change around the international financial system to be able to mobilize the resources that are needed to finance the transition, climate finance, as well as the broader development agenda. And the 40 billion that I spoke about is only a component of the bigger 89 billion that is lost annually in Africa's sector. So how do we then going forward ensure that the 40 billion is retained for our use? So the first R, so I said there are 5 R's, so I'll speak to 3 of the R's. How can tax be used as a tool for mobilizing resources going forward? So the first R speaks to the raising revenue, which I've touched on briefly. And the first thing I want to say here is that the system in its current form, the international financial system or the international tax system in its current form, cannot allow us to mobilize resources needed from this sector. And so an UNCTAD report that highlighted these numbers reveals that of the 89 billion lost annually, 40 billion alone is from the extractive sector. Another report by the IMF highlighted that in sub-Saharan Africa, 700 million United States dollars is lost annually just from the sub-Saharan region, and that is a modest estimation. So all these numbers, why all the numbers? These are figures of potential revenue that could support women's rights services as well as the broader climate agenda issue. So in terms of going forward, the big ask that we are asking under raising revenue, to be able to raise revenue that finances our development, we need to overhaul, not reform. I think seeing things from a feminist lens, which I really appreciate, is that it's noted that the current system doesn't work. So what we need to do is actually restructure or overhaul the current tax system to be able to mobilize the resources. And 3 things here need to happen. Currently, I don't know if you've been following in the tax justice movement, there's a push to move global tax policy from the OECD to the UN. And this was finally adopted late last year, which was a big win for the tax justice movement. And so there is traction that is happening. But more than that, I think at a regional level, how do we begin to push for policies such as the Africa mining vision to be domesticated so that we begin to do mining that is not externalized? I think you agree with me that most of the minerals that we produce go out in their raw form, right? And so that in itself is what exacerbates the problem of illicit financial flows. So going forward, we are saying, can we begin to do mining from a Pan-African agenda? Can we begin to do mining that really localizes the sector to the indigenous local economy to be able to establish the backward and forward linkages for the local people themselves to be located in the mining value chain, right? So we are saying no more mining raw materials that go out in their raw form. The future of mining has to look different. The future of mining has to ensure that minerals have value addition added to them. The third is at national level, I think there is need for a reform that needs to happen with fiscal policy. For example, particularly around tax incentives, we can't keep giving tax incentives to big multinational companies at the expense of local actors, for example, in the artisanal and small-scale mining. Yes, the argument is that we need to give tax incentives to attract FDI, but research has shown that mining companies will still come because the resource is in the ground. So how do we then begin to restructure our tax incentives so that then we are not only giving them to multinationals, but also giving them to local actors? I'm being warned that time is up, so my last point will be around reparations. I've missed 1 hour, Eunice. So the reparations point, I think, which speaks very closely to the climate agenda, that the big polluters that have caused the climate change should be the ones to pay for reparations. So how do we ensure that they then begin to pay their fair share? And in this instant, perhaps in effecting taxes on windfall so that then that money is ring-fenced to be able to support mechanisms around loss and damage. I'll end here and then add on later on. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Mukupa. You now agree with me that she's a tax justice expert. So to shift the power, I'm going to request that we take 1 minute. You speak to your neighbor. From what Mukupa has just shared, what has stood out for you? What do you take away? And then we'll go to the next panelist. So we need to be shifting power, not only to the panelists, but to the room. So are you going to keep?
We're done with this conference next week, later next week. We should sit down and talk about critical minerals work that we're working to align with the mining vision and the tax justice aspect. We need to push this agenda.
Agreed.
Because this is where the hijacking is.
Yes. And I think it will just be building on existing legacies, right? So if we don't change the system, more of that will continue. So yeah.
And the critical mining buyers club is already.
Oh yeah, you spoke about it.
Yeah.
They're creating it.
Well, it's already created. They have a lobbying group based in London that's organizing African climate.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Wasn't that nice to speak to your neighbor? Okay, so we'll quickly move to the next speaker, who is Mariam Ibrahim. She's the Growth and Partnership Lead at Development Initiatives. She leads work where she campaigns for data ecosystems to be inclusive of all voices. Development Initiatives sees better information as being fundamental to better policy making and influencing. Without much ado, I'll request Mariam to take it away.
Thank you. And it's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you to the organizers for giving us this opportunity to be part of this conversation. So as DI, the immediate conversation was starting from the financing side. We've been tracking financial flows for the last 30 years as an organization, looking at development financing, humanitarian financing, climate financing more recently, and simplifying that for decision making. But for today's discussion, I want to focus on another also very important area that we focus on as an organization, which is the inclusive data ecosystems. So basically the importance of data in this whole conversation. We know that in today's world, data is power. We know that it helps us to make informed decisions. It helps us to understand complex issues and plan for the future and hold our decision makers to account. But yet, we still see the voices of women and data on women missing. So when we are having this conversation, how can we then understand the interactions between economic and climate policies with a strong feminist focus without comprehensive, sustainable gender data? So my points today, or what I want us to take away, will be focused around that, and also maybe some examples from some of the work that we've been doing as an organization. So we talk about a gender-responsive foundational data ecosystem and the importance of having that in place. We know the data ecosystem means, all the data value chain, right from collection to analysis to impact, and we know the various actors that are in place. But what do we mean when we talk about a gender-responsive foundational data ecosystem? It's a comprehensive and integrated system that includes all types of data, from administrative to survey to satellite data, and this is owned and managed nationally. So at DI, what we see as an important cornerstone for this is the importance of foundational data ecosystem, registration systems. So Mukupa, you talked about, the importance of, changing the systems. So what we do need is systems that count every birth and death to produce vital statistics, ensure women and girls are not invisible. Systems that officially document marriages to support property and land ownership. So the emphasis of governments having that. And this kind of foundational data linking to the conversation on monitoring the economy is really important. Kupa, you emphasized the need for us to mobilize resources. How will a government know who to tax, what business to tax, when the data is not there? So this is the importance of having this kind of foundational systems in place. The other area that we see there's a gap, like in terms of when we look at poverty and inequality data, it's mostly at household surveys, so not focused on the individuals. We know there are other methods that we can use and bring into play, including, having administrative data, the health centers that collect data when it comes to sexual rights, for example, the police stations and recording crime. So how can we, and this data is like all over the place, so the emphasis is how can we bring all this information together to inform the policies, to make sure that resources are targeted. So that's the first area, strengthening these foundational data systems, which is very important. The second point, I think we touched on as we were beginning the conversation, that when it comes to disasters, women are affected differently. We are, at the forefront in terms of contributing, but we also face the impact of climate change. And we need better data to be able to have target them specifically in terms of the resources when it comes to disaster risk reduction. But we also, when it comes to the care economy, we know there's a gap, there's missing data. When it comes to the SDGs, we have 151 countries who don't have the data. So how do we capture women's contribution to the economy, contributions to GDP through unpaid care work? I'm sure even for most of us in the room, climate increases the care responsibilities, but we also face the burden of caring for elderly people, for children and the like. So really, the emphasis here is that we have missing data, and there's a lot that needs to be done to strengthen that. My third point is we know there are gaps, but then there's also a lot of data out there that can be used as, sometimes as proxies for different things. And really, for example, like with the civil society organizations, that's a way to bring in the voices of communities and making sure that this data is inclusive of people who are living the experiences, for example. So I wanted to provide an example from some work that we've done in the disability space, because we're talking about also intersectional data. We, together with the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development, they started an initiative on called Inclusive Data Charter. I'm sure if you've heard of it. But basically, this recognizes that, there are technical challenges when it comes to disaggregating data, but it's also about the political and financial commitments by national governments. And we help to design that kind of approach. And while we were working with the ministry responsible for social protection, what we discovered in terms of official sources, we brought together different data sources from different ministries. And we could see 43 different data sources that, if brought together as one data inventory, could be used by the ministries. And this included both official and unofficial data. We see also that, civil society generate data as well. And we've supported through providing them with the capacity to ensure that that kind of data is included in official statistics. And there's a lot more to be done on that space. I know my time is ending, but maybe to emphasize, why is this conversation important now in the context of the global stock tech in particular? I mean, we know what the gaps are. We know the challenges. We've heard about them in this conference in terms of the financing gap and where we are falling behind. We've discussed the solutions and the opportunities as well. But this is also about raising the ambitions of countries. And data can act as a very important lever in the process, and gender data in particular. So I think this is an important area to look at, not only as people working on gender data, but we have others working on DRR data, we have others working on climate data. So bringing all that together to inform policies. So in terms of my key recommendation will be joining up the data, having inclusive data, strengthening the capacity of local actors, and all of us working in a very coordinated way to provide this intersectional data and intersectional outcomes. I was very pleased to see the initiative UNFCCC and also listening to what we do about the Gender and Environment Data Alliance. I think it's a good example where various actors have been brought into one place to bring all the knowledge and information that can create this kind of change. So this will it's not only a rights issue, it's also about our economies, it's also about strengthening the resilience of countries, and improving, climate policies. So yeah, I hope we'd keep that spirit and continue to work together. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much for ensuring that we are actually data rich in this room with all the statistics. And because of time, we're going to quickly move to Anne. Anne is a senior climate change and energy advisor at Christian Aid. She has cut her craft in the area of energy. She's determined and committed to ensure she ends energy poverty. And because of that, she will be speaking to us on the issues related to both natural resource governance and climate change, but specifically what the African Development Bank can do in terms of getting us there where we want to get to. So Anne, you're welcome. Let's encourage her with a hand clap.
Thank you so much, Eunice. Thank you to my fellow panelists. It's an honor to be here. This is an important event. We know that it's being streamed live, and we know that it's important for the global stocktake process. And so we take great importance in some of the points that we are forwarding here. And so I'm very excited that the Feminist Action Nexus brought us together with the Africa Women and Gender Constituency. And I appreciate their work very much. And so why do we need to reimagine economies? And this is the topic for today. We know that they're leading us to paths that are unsustainable. And if there's anything that has shown us that in a big way, it's a climate crisis. And so I do feel like one of the things that we need to think about is we need to, there needs to be priority on adaptation-related financing, and I know most of you have had that here. And this public financing for adaptation is very important to build resilience of populations and to reduce the risk on their livelihoods. We know how important it is for us to have this adaptation financing. And of course, women and communities that are at the front lines of the crisis are usually the ones that are most affected. And that's why this piece of work is very important. And it's important to also now start thinking about this system that Mukupa and Mariam have talked about. Eunice has also talked about it. Is this system working for us? Is it working? We know that it's not. Countries are saddled with debt. We know that it was mentioned during the Africa Climate Summit that at least 26 countries are either in debt distress or the countries are under, they're in terrible, or they're in unsustainable debt regimes. And so what does that mean? It means we need to start thinking about GDP as a measure. So for these countries, a lot of countries that are being affected by debt and, you know, the climate crisis and not being able to rise up as quickly as other countries, we need to consider some more nuanced metrics. And, you know, these need to take into account a lot of things. For instance, we have talked about so much about lived realities, and this is very important. It's also important to think about context because solutions cannot cut across, and GDP cannot mean the same thing to all these different countries. And so these need to take into, account the impacts of climate, for instance, COVID, and debt, of course. And these measures need to, the GDP needs to be more representative and more nuanced. And of course, we've had how much, 23 billion in deals during this summit. And what does that mean? It means that there's a lot of, and we've seen a lot of private finance, of course. And so while private finance may be quick to deploy, will it provide the crucial public services that are being affected by the climate crisis? And will it provide it rapidly? And will it lead countries not to be in debt? So we need to think about the profit motive of private sector while also thinking about public sector and the role they play in financing social protection and other social services. And so such financing, it's very easy for it to further increase the care work burden on women. We know that there'll be a lot of dependency on privatized public services because we know some of these are some of the ways that this will come out. And this will make all of these services, many of them inaccessible to populations. And of course, we know what that means for livelihoods. So as governments here, of course, have been keen to think about private finance. It's critical that there's greater thinking about the alternatives. And it's also unclear, and I'm just saying this because it's important to say it. The UNFCCC has set out, there's a new climate goal, a new climate finance goal that's being discussed. And this is, it is critical because we know that the goal will be more nuanced. And of course, it's coming up, and it's important for us to think that, to think how such financing that has been discussed in such summits, you know, how it fits within this. We know that African countries want more adaptation financing, and so it must fit within this framework of the UNFCCC that recognizes common but differentiated responsibilities and relevant responsibilities. And of course, the bank, the AFDB has announced several funding windows. They announced the Africa Adaptation Initiative, about a $1 billion fund. They also launched the Climate Action Window of the Africa, as part of the replenishment of the Africa Development Fund. And so the funding is about, it's about $400 million US. And, you know, it's going to fund several sectors, including green energy, climate services and information. And so we need to think about some of these policies and how they're anchored, some of this funding and how it's anchored within important policies. For instance, we need to think if it's green energy, how is it anchored? How is it Paris aligned? Yeah, aligned to the Paris commitments. And also, we also need to be very keen about some solutions that do not work in our context. Then, of course, yesterday, the African Union had an amazing, amazing session where innovators from Africa, yes, thanks. Innovators from Africa presented a lot of climate innovations, and one young man presented a 3 megawatt wind turbine that can run, on low wind speeds. And so, even for the bank that has this, the African Adaptation Initiative that looks to scale such inventions, we need to think about even more small-scale entrepreneurs like those, because, for instance, that young man wanted to scale it to 15 megawatts, and so there needs to be such thinking about where this funding will go. And of course, just to think about the private mobilization of financing that the bank has said, we need to really think critically about this. We need to have greater thought on that. And the states decried, a lot of high interest rates than their global north counterparts. These are some of the things that we need to think about when we're talking about the global infrastructure, architecture, change in the architecture and reforms. And finally, during the closing of the summit yesterday, there were many declarations and pronouncements. The youth wanted to come up with an intergenerational youth fund, and of course, others wanted to come up with an indigenous fund. So we need to think about the technical expertise that exists in states, but also with the bank, for how sustainable models for funding can also be enhanced when we're thinking about such solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anne, and thank you very much, Mariam. So once again, we'll shift this back to the room. I'm going to request that you speak to your neighbor. Think about Mariam's presentation on the need for data and what sort of data we need, but then more critically in terms of climate finance. Having been here this whole week, what is it that you feel was missing in the conversation of climate finance that needs to be brought on the table? Over to you. Speak to your neighbor or find a new neighbor, whichever it is.
Why is not moving? Very slow. Yes, thank you.
All right. Hellos. I hope you had great conversations. We'll now do a just transition back to the panel. So welcome with me Fadel Kabu, who is the president. You know Americans use president, they like these things. So Fadel is a president. I have to tease you because you're a man. He's the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. He's an associate professor of economics at Denison University, Ohio, US. And he's also the president, I've said that. He has another illustrious introduction, but not to take away from the very beautiful presentation that he has prepared for us this afternoon. I will ask you to Google his bio. So for now, we'll give him 10 minutes to make this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you again.
Encourage him with a hand clap.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here and for the kind invitation and for the very thought-provoking and inspiring remarks from my co-panelist here. And with appreciation to the interpreters, I apologize for speaking very fast to go through the 10 minutes I was allowed to comment on here. So with that, I would like to start with this first slide, which the Just Transition report, which there are 10 copies there on the chair. Please feel free to take them. The website is justtransitionafrica.org. It's a report that I had the pleasure to work on under the leadership of Dr. Yuba Sekona from the IPCC, the outgoing vice chair of the IPCC from Mali. And my remarks will be a reflection of a lot of thought that went into this particular report on just transition, underlining the concept of justice. And if you allow me, I'll start with a couple of points and then lead into the details. When Martin Luther King Jr. was talking about the civil rights movement, the context of the civil rights movement and the concept of justice, he said, "I have no time for the tranquilizing drugs of gradualism and incrementalism." And similarly, we are looking for transformative action, not tranquilizing drugs and misleading false solutions and so on. So that's point number one. Point number two, when we talk about justice and just transition when it comes to the climate space, when it comes to development, when it comes to all the issues that we care about, we can't ignore the concept of power and geopolitics, because this is not going to be something that one leader in one country is going to deliver justice to their people. There's an overarching global financial architecture, international trade architecture that was established in 1944 when most of this continent was colonized. And that architecture was deepened and enforced in the subsequent decades. So a system, a financial architecture adheres. But we also have the right, as Africans, as people of the Global South, to develop our long-term strategic vision for ourselves, to reposition ourselves on that map. And I'll explain what I mean by that. If you don't have a vision for yourself, I guarantee you're part of somebody else's vision on this big map. So what is the vision and the role we've been assigned for the last several hundred years, and what is the role that some would like to see us remain in? They see us as four things: the place for cheap raw materials, the place for dumping industrialized world output for us as consumers. They see us as a place for exotic tourist destinations at low cost, and they see us as the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the global north, is delivered to us as development, as aid, as technical assistance, as cooperation. So that is the role we played in the past, and that cannot be the role we play moving forward if we want to deliver justice and if we want to fight climate change and undo the structures that have put us in this place, in this position to begin with. So three major structural deficiencies I'd like to highlight that cannot be ignored. The first one, kind of the overarching one, is the problem of external debt, and I'm not bringing any news here. It's a very serious problem, but it's actually a symptom of much deeper structural problems that cannot be ignored in this just transition debate. Number one, energy deficits. And that is even for a country like Nigeria, a big exporter of fossil fuels, imports 100% of its gasoline today, not by accident, by design. Food deficits. We import 85% of our food on this continent when we used to be the breadbasket of the world. Not by accident, it's system design. And that's the systemic stuff that needs to be addressed. And number three, low value added manufacturing. That's the role we've been assigned, either extractive industries like mining with no value addition, or import capital, import energy, import intermediate components, and even the packaging, and use low cost labor racing to the bottom to add very little value for export. So you import high value added content, you export low value added content, there's no way you're going to get out of that trap. No matter how much you double, triple, quadruple your export-led growth initiatives, you're always digging yourself deeper into these structures. And that adds up to a trade deficit, a structural trade deficit, which in simple terms, when you have a trade deficit, your currency depreciates, weakens relative to the dollar, relative to the euro. So now you have a weak currency, and the next morning you need to buy food for your people, medicine for your people, or anything from abroad, you buy it at a higher cost. So we literally import inflation, and that puts us in a defensive position. Our governments immediately intervene with a Band-Aid solution to protect the most vulnerable from food inflation and fuel inflation and so on. So what do? We subsidize food, we subsidize fuel, and we ask our central banks to borrow dollars and euros and British pounds in order to artificially stabilize the exchange rate. And that's a Band-Aid, because we do that every year. Fast forward, you have a debt crisis after debt crisis after debt crisis, and you lose your economic and monetary sovereignty in perpetuity. I'm sorry, the clicker is not very effective. Take this on a global scale. Divide the world into global north and global south, and net out all global financial transactions, trade, FDI, remittances, interest payments, debt relief, everything is included here. The net amount, the last figure we have, is $2 trillion, that green line. $2 trillion moving from the poorest countries to the richest countries. And notice the number is accelerating. We don't do anything about this system, and we meet again here in 5 years, that number will be maybe $3, $5, $7 trillion, who knows, moving in the wrong direction. So the summary of the unjust system that we operate in is the following. That big circle right there, that's the $2 trillion moving in the wrong direction. In the meanwhile, we have $100 billion of climate fund that was not delivered. Most of it is loans to keep perpetuating the debt cycle. You have a green climate fund, that tiny little dot there. The last time I checked, it was about $11 or $12 billion in it. And that white dot right there that you can't see, that's the loss and damage fund. It's still empty. So how does this deliver justice? How does this deliver just transition or climate action? This is insulting. This is unacceptable. So, just eyeballing the problem. This is the composition of Africa's imports. Notice the value-added content that's built in there. And notice the amount, $737 billion. I picked 2019 to avoid the COVID disruption and all that, but the numbers are similar every year. And now notice Africa's exports. Can you eyeball the problem? Raw materials, right? So we have, and you go country after country after country. Randomly, I picked Ghana today. Look at Ghana's imports, and look at the volume of Ghana's imports, $27 billion. And look at Ghana's exports. You can clearly see the problem. And look at the volume, 25 billion. So what does that do to Ghana's exchange rate? It weakens systematically, year after year, relative to the dollar. When the picture is going up, that's weaker relative to the dollar. And then the flip side of that is the external debt problem, increasing exponentially. It's unstoppable unless we go to the structural solutions. Again, if you're not, and I'm sorry, I'm going to use a term that's very scary politically, if we're not radical, and radical, I don't mean it in the political sense, I mean it in the literal sense of the term. Radical meaning going to the roots of the problem. And the opposite of radical is superficial. So if we're not radical, going to the roots of the problem, we're superficial, we're reproducing the system. So the solutions are investments in agroecology and food sovereignty on a national, regional, continental level. Investments in renewable energy sovereignty, so we can leapfrog into a sustainable energy system and deliver electricity to the 600 million people who don't have any access to it today. Deliver clean cooking technology and infrastructure to the 970 million people, mostly women and children, who are daily inhaling toxic fumes because no access to clean cooking. And number 3, changing our position in the global value chain and moving towards high value added manufacturing. And the opportunity here is Pan-African industrial policy, where we can leverage the strategic minerals we have on this continent, as we said earlier on this panel, and build the value chain on this continent, not to produce electricity for export, not to produce manufacturing products for consumption in the global north, but to deploy clean cooking technology, transportation, health, the building blocks of a just and sustainable economy. No country in the world can function without food, without fuel. And we tend to skip those two building blocks and focus on other distractions. So build the foundations from the beginning. And then, as I mentioned earlier, transforming the global and financial and trade and investment architecture so we can rebalance the global economy. This is not about Africa or the global south dominating the world. This is about positioning ourselves as equals, as sovereigns in a competitive world. And as many of our independence leaders from the beginning said, including the first president of this country, friends of all, enemies of none. Like Mia Motley often says, friends of all, satellites of none. So when we develop our coherent, comprehensive vision for a just transition as a continent, as a global south, then we go out to our partners, whether it's China or Japan or the US or Germany, and say, this is our vision for transformation. Will you partner with us? Will we direct climate finance and adaptation finance to these building blocks? Will you channel technical assistance to these building blocks? And if you're not, then you're really not helping in this. And with that, I'll stop here. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Fadel, for using data to demonstrate and wrap up this conversation in such a powerful way. And maybe the question to ask is, looking at the Nairobi Declaration and what Fadel has just presented, can we do a quick measurement of whether it's transitioning to the vision that Fadel has just presented to us? So back to the room for that conversation with your neighbor, looking at the Nairobi Declaration and the vision that we need to have as Africans, as Pan-Africans. Does that translate? Over to you.
I just arrived. Give me a minute. But it already started.
Yes.
A long time ago?
Yes.
I'm just lost.
I am lost as well.
Okay.
So we're all lost.
It's okay then.
Thank you. Thank you. Can we come back to the room? Thank you. Thank you for those intimate conversations. Now we want to ensure that we are on the same page as a collective. So any questions, comments, contributions, and we are going to respect the African Union rules of no lectures, no speeches, just 1 minute interventions. Okay, let me see the hands that are ready. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'll take the fifth. Fifth. Yes, we'll take those 5. Where's the mic? People have to come and, okay. So Gertrude, you have to go and stand on that mic there. So let's have the first intervention. No speeches, no long interventions, just quick inputs. We left the speeches for the summit.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity. I just have 2 very short questions. How can we transform the system to turn the dependency design upside down if our governance remains undemocratic, dictatorial, non-transparent? The only other time the economy was powered by renewable energy is during the slave trade. It was the compliance of despot kings that were attracted by mirrors and beads. So it's a pattern that keeps repeating itself. How can we do that without transforming our governance system? Secondly, the GDP and care work burden. There are calls for another metric other than GDP to measure a country's economic performance. Because GDP is quantitative, it measures only figures. This new metric that we are calling for is qualitative and takes into account things that can't quite be captured in figures, things like care work. What do you have to say about that? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gertrude. We'll have the second. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Leslie Green. I'm from the University of Cape Town, where I work with the Environmental Humanities South Research Centre. I sat in this room 2 or 3 days ago, perhaps it was even yesterday, but with our sisters, Her Excellencies across the panel, speaking and listening to the kind of propositions that our sisters just described as pretty much like the slave trade, mirrors and beads. And in particular, the question that I wanted to ask, I had ready to ask, which I was so frustrated they gave no time for discussion, was I wanted to ask our American sister, who was the Undersecretary of Agriculture, are you going to supply your agricultural solutions in perpetuity? Because, and I presume the answer was going to be no. I wanted to ask her, then, my dear sister, what are you going to say to the woman who is faced with having to go into the sex trade in order to feed her children when your seed subsidy ends? I want to ask the feminist movement, to ask our sisters who are being held up as the face of Africa's women, to ask the hard questions, to come around the sides and ask, what does your African feminism mean if you can sell out the future of Africa's women? Thank you.
Thank you. And not every woman is a feminist. And here in Kenya, the first ladies are very key to tell you they are not feminists, but the third speaker. I'm not here to speak, so the third speaker.
Right, thank you so much, everybody. I decided never to ask any question here in this particular summit or conference, but you motivated me, really, and thank you so much. I want to say 3 things. which is important. Please don't cut me, because I'll be very brief. Number one, we sold our future as a people. And therefore, for me, I'm a pastoralist Maasai elder. I'm a Maasai elder. And I know one thing. I'm a victim, and my mentality is a victim mentality sitting in me. I have no courage to tackle and to transform my situation unless, one, I bust the myth around the things that are being said. To do that, I must reposition, re-engineer, and trust myself so that I'm a human being again before I tackle my problem. Coming from a victim mentality to becoming a human being, I need to reposition myself to use my philosophy of being, of becoming, and belonging before I tackle my problem. I need to bust the myth. Here, the way I have been educated is to maintain a culture of silence. And a culture of silence is destructive. It makes me very quiet and very shy and unable to speak out what I feel. Until I bust that, I can't revolutionize things. So I wanted to say, really, and very, very importantly, I don't have that word in English, but I say it in my own language. Climate change never started now for us. We have never asked anybody to help us. We had a system in my tribe. It is called Ewoloto. And Ewoloto is if you lost your 100 or 200 cows, not because of negligence, we will all come to you and contribute 1 cow, 1 goat, 1 sheep. If we are 100 or 500, you get to start again. And you never ask anybody, we ask ourselves. Can't we, for once, go back to those indigenous, very little, not as powerful as your banks, but they're very useful and have helped us. How do we go back?
Thank you for motivating us with that very powerful indigenous remembrance. Thank you so much. The fourth speaker?
I'm here.
Yes. The fourth and then the fifth, please move to the mic as well. Oh, you're right there.
Hi. Thank you very much for a very inspiring panel. This is to Fidel particularly. As we reimagine the economies of climate justice, and we know that the African Union has the African Free Common Trade Agreement, how can we use instruments like that within the African Union to then redeploy money back into the climate justice and the climate markets that we need?
Thank you. And the final intervention.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think all the speakers were extremely motivational, and there were so many questions I had, but I'll try to stick to one. And I'll stick to our gentleman friend here, because he really motivated us so well by being fearless in what he talked about. And I think one of the things which really hit my attention was about foreign exchange, the depreciation of currency. And I know lots of things in the past have happened because of that. And even today, I mean, I was traveling to the UK, and it's about 190 shillings a pound, and dollar has become about 155, and it's becoming very difficult for many things to happen because everything is pegged to the dollar to some extent, imports and all that. And I'm just asking that, is there any solution to that? Because at one time, I remember Colonel Gaddafi was talking about an organization, United States of Africa, and he wanted to deal in gold. And I think it was a brilliant idea, but then I think he was then taken away. I mean, I'm just talking. But, you know, the point is that what are we going to do about making sure we have a United States of Africa with maybe something like the Eurobond, and that it can also happen here in Africa for us? I mean, why are we buying dollars and then buying Uganda shillings again? You know, or Tanzanian shillings, we first buy dollars and then do that. You know, it doesn't make sense.
It doesn't exactly.
So I think that is the way forward. I'm looking forward to seeing something like that at this summit also.
Thank you. And finally, I'm sorry, you are the fifth participants, and then we'll come back to the panel and wrap up and close here.
Okay. Good afternoon, I believe. My name is Fatuma, and I had a question in line with what the president was saying. I believe that the climate financing is a good initiative coming into Africa because we are the ones, the global south is bearing the brunt, sorry. So, but the global north is the polluter. Why are we not funding them? Why are they not funding themselves to improve their systems so we don't have to bear the brunt? That's
Exactly. Why are they funding themselves to stop polluting the environment? I love that. Thank you so much. I hadn't had that question asked before. Thank you very much. And so back to this panel before we get thrown out of this room. So we'll start, Mariam, with your quick final thoughts, and we'll end with Fadel, who had most of the questions.
Thank you. Okay. I think most of the questions, I also thought it was really powerful what Fadel presented, and most of the questions are linked to that radical thinking. I just wanted to say two things. One on, in terms of the care economy and measuring, looking at quantitative data, but we believe in all sources of data, as I said before. So we could, there's need for that complementary approach where qualitative data is also considered and brought into the conversation, and is also checked to be sound methodologically and checked. So I think that's an important component. Yeah, and including, of course, the voices of, like my fellow pastoralist talked about, in terms of including our voices into the design and making sure all these processes are inclusive. But my final point about the architecture reform, I did say that we've been working in the financing space for many years, tracking aid. We know the system is not working, and it's about suggesting certain solutions, and we are also piloting an idea called global public investments. So I would encourage colleagues in the room to look it up online. There's been lots of conversations on that this week, but this is a system that can be applied to what my sister talked about on the regional funds that we set up, including now that we are going to be implementing the CFTA. That's going to be based on certain principles that include all contribute, all benefit, all decide. So it's a system around shifting the architecture to a much more dignified approach of partnerships. So I won't go into details because of time, but that's something that we could also contribute to the conversation and bring in maybe some of the radical thinking. Thank you.
Thank you. 30 seconds, Anne.
Again, why do we need to reimagine economies? We've all spoken about this. I want to mention something very critical on the GDP issue. I know we did talk about it and the need for greater nuance. So there's need for more non-economic data on loss and damage. So this is an important aspect that we need to capture, and we could push this as some of the advocacy we do. And part of the reason we're talking about adaptation is because this is just one of the ways that we can empower our communities and ourselves to take on some of the challenges that we are facing. So appreciating the Africa WGC once more and the Feminist Action Nexus for Economic and Climate Justice. Thank you, Eunice.
Thank you. We need a metric on love. How much love are we spreading? It's also important. Over to you, Mukupa.
Yeah, very, very powerful interventions. I think reimagining economies will require that we reimagine a new architecture that actually works for us, right? And it starts by having a vision. So from the mining perspective, extractives, what vision do we want for our continent? How do we want to use our resources? And all this can only be achieved using 3 Ps: people, power, political will. And I loved how our Maasai brother took us down, the personal, right? It should also be political. What do we as a people want for ourselves? And so Pan-Africanism, the African unity is so important. Once we identify with that, we can then challenge and push back against global North hegemony. Thanks.
Thank you. In memory of our Professor Micheri from Nairobi, we need Utu or Ubuntu. Thank you. Over to you, Fadel.
Very briefly, on the dictatorship, democracy, governance question and transformation, you can't democratize a system that hasn't been decolonized yet. And here's what I mean. If I'm elected democratically in a fair, transparent, and I'm now in office, I'm supposed to deliver to the demands of my people. But my economy is not under my control. I don't have economic sovereignty. I'm going to have to either ignore them or throw democracy under the bus or something. So as we democratize, we can't ignore that we need to decolonize the economy that I described today. On GDP as a metric, it's the worst thing that the economics profession has invented, and there are many, many other better metrics that take into account not only the care economy, the unpaid work, that mostly women deliver, but also the ecological damage that should be discounted, right? When we spill oil and spend millions to clean it, GDP goes up. When more people have cancer and have to spend money from pollution, GDP goes up because it's spending, right? So there's other alternative metrics that we need to push for as a standard for measuring quality of life and well-being, and there's a lot of research there. Just we need the final push to get that as the standard. On the free trade agreement, the African Free Trade Agreement, a great idea, but if we're all going to trade low value-added content to each other, we're still entrapping ourselves in the same economic structures. So free trade on the continent has a potential, but with the transformation that is needed. So the value chain that we described here, leveraging critical minerals, industrializing to deliver the building blocks of our economy in a free trade zone, that's how we reap the benefits. But under the current economic structures, it's not going to take us anywhere, unfortunately. On the foreign exchange question and the idea of a United States of Africa, a single currency, yes, but a single currency system can only be successful if it has solid economic structure, right? And the idea of backing a currency by gold, very briefly, I'll say absolutely not. It's not the transformative solution that we need for reasons I can explain. So the whole debate about de-dollarizing, again, you can't de-dollarize a system that hasn't been decolonized yet. So you have to do the hard work to build the resilient structure. And then you build unity on a single currency, and it doesn't have to be backed by gold or cryptocurrency or anything like that. And the principle of polluters pay, we agree, absolutely. That's why we're here, right? And polluters pay not just to fix their economy, but to repair the damage that they caused, right? So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We have another session beginning in a few minutes. Thank you for coming to this session to be part of that radical revolution. My takeaway from this is that we need the people who believe in radicalism to become presidents. So become presidents. Thank you.
The bag is open, eh?